So let's jump into Steve Jobs, because I've listened to so many Steve Jobs biographies, podcasts about Steve Jobs, so many different things about Steve Jobs. He was super interesting. So did you know Steve Jobs was adopted? Okay, so Steve Jobs was adopted. His parents were from, I think, Lebanon, and he was adopted when he was super young, to a family in California, and he was an only child basically. And his parents were, like, from all accounts, like really really good people, very supportive and awesome. But one of the interesting things to learn about Steve Jobs that I thought was really really cool is that he just had this very natural way of just like reaching out to people if he had a question about something. And by the way, people don't give him credit for this, but Steve Jobs was technical. Like, he used to. So one of the things that he's kind of famous for was he was able to have a call with the CEO of Hewlett Packard, which at the time was a really really prominent like technology company. Obviously, we all know HP, like printers and other things like that, but Hewlett Packard was definitely a pioneer in that space, and very popular and a big company at the time. But Steve Jobs would build like little circuits and little gadgets and things. And one time he needed a part for this particular gadget he was building, and it was an HP part that HP had on their like catalog. And Steve basically was just like dialing numbers in the phone book for HP, and one of the numbers that he called was, I think, like the corporate office, and he was able to get like patched through to the CEO, who I think Michael Hewlett. I don't know his full name. I'm sorry, Hewlett. He was able to talk to Hewlett, and basically he was asking like, "Hey, so like I'm building this thing, like I need this part, and can you help me like decide which one to get? I don't know if it's this one or this one." And basically he told Steve Jobs all the information he needed, but he also gave him an internship to work at HP that summer. And I think this was when Steve was either in high school or possibly even younger, but no, I think he was in high school. But yeah, so he's known for doing that a lot, which basically just like if he had a question or he needed to get answers to something, he just took massive action to just go get the information, and he would literally just dial numbers in the phone book. So he really was, even from like a young age, just kind of someone who just like went out and like got stuff done, and whatever he wanted to do, whatever sort of ambition he had, he went out and he conquered it. I think that's something a lot of people don't give him credit for. Also, the fact that he was technical, like he actually did understand a lot about electronics and things like that. A lot of people think that Steve Wozniak was like the only one who did all of the programming and all of the technology stuff. Which is true for the majority of Apple's life. Steve did a lot of the kind of design work and a lot of the user experience and product design. But he was also semi-technical. He knew enough to be dangerous in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm taking away from it is like he just, whatever he wanted to do, he went and did it. He took action fearlessly, right? We're posting this podcast because we want to post it, and it doesn't matter necessarily what the result is. We're just going to take action, and we're going to get it out there, so if he wanted that answer, he was going to go and get it, whatever the outcome is, so he was an action taker.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things that's pretty interesting about Steve is, so a lot of people know that he, actually, did you know that he got fired from Apple?
Yeah, the board kicked him out and he made Next or whatever.
Yep, exactly. So what's kind of funny about that is, he got, ousted from Apple when Apple was still a pretty small company. And he went and he basically built Next, right? Next Computer, which was, Next had lots of problems because they wanted to build this machine that really could be like a consumer product, something that regular people could use for computing, but it kind of morphed into this really really expensive machine that really only their goal was to sell it to universities so that a computer lab filled with Next computers could be used by students, and they weren't really able to execute on that. But what Next did do was that they ended up building really, really good software, right? So their operating system for their computers at the time was really, really good as far as like what the rest of the industry was using for different operating systems, including Apple. And so what ended up happening is that Apple ended up buying Next Computer from Steve Jobs, which is kind of ironic. The company that Steve founded and kind of made successful, or at least at the time mildly successful, ended up buying his other company, which was kind of failing, but he did have this operating system that was really, really good. And Steve basically, got that buyout. It was really great for him because he was able to, sort of refill his bank account because he poured tons of money into Next. And then eventually, I should also add, at the time, Apple Computer was struggling quite a lot. They were kind of like, decreasing in sales and not really able to innovate, and their operating system wasn't good. Basically, Apple had lost its way. Like they lost that culture of excellence.
They needed him back, and they took him back.
They really did need him back. And yeah, everybody knows the story. He ends up finding his way back to Apple, and it all, the rest is history. He goes on to launch many more successful products, and then the iPhone, which is the most successful product of all time, and Apple, I think, is still today the most profitable company, ever, which is kind of amazing, right? We think of companies that are profitable as being like software companies, right? It's like, basically
Margins.
non-zero. Yeah, like basically like zero fixed or zero variable cost, right? So you just have like sort of massive leverage. You can build a huge company if it's software, but that doesn't, didn't stop Apple, a physical product company, from being the most profitable company. And there's just so many reasons that happened, but ultimately, like Apple, the brand, and this is why Warren Buffett loves Apple, or at least for the last like decade has been touting Apple as one of his best stocks. Basically, I don't know if you know this. Guess what the percentage of Berkshire Hathaway's investment in Apple is?
No idea. 42%.
50%. Half of Berkshire is Apple.
Yeah.
Which is like, that's the power law at work, right? The things that's going to bring the most returns are always going to be, like one or two, and then you're just going to have tons of other like, good performers. But ultimately, Apple is still the cash cow. And the reason for that is because
Brand.
Apple has brand. Exactly. Yep. Brand is kind of like the ultimate lever in business. You can have a great product that's super, super cheap to replicate, like software. A great software product can be awesome, but if you have an awesome brand, you can sell a $15 t-shirt for, $400, and that's what Louis Vuitton is. So ultimately, brand is pricing power, right? If you have a fantastic brand, you have fantastic pricing power.
Yeah, and bringing this back to team, like if you have an awesome brand about your team, just you guys are killers, culture of excellence, that makes the world of a difference. So be sure to just continually develop that brand and that personality of awesome in your team and in your products and in everything. So that's how people will see you, so.
Yeah. Totally agree. I mean, I kind of want to give a little bit of a talk about like leadership and executive management. I don't have all of the answers here, but I want to talk about John D. Rockefeller if you want to talk about him a little
Go
bit.
for it.
So John D. Rockefeller, as a lot of people know, he was the guy who created Standard Oil, one of the companies that basically changed America and the world through their contribution to the oil industry. So in the late 1800s, Standard Oil is created after Rockefeller actually, I want to jump into his early life because he's got a really interesting upbringing that a lot of people don't know about. He was not born to like a family of means by any imagination. He was born in Ohio in a pretty small town. His dad was basically like a vagabond who was kind of like a con artist and wasn't really around a lot. And he was basically this guy who would go from town to town, like selling snake oil. He would basically pretend to be a doctor, and he'd say like, "Oh, like I'm going to cure cancer. All cases of cancer cured with my special like tincture." And he would basically like con people, and he had a whole bunch of other schemes. Like, he was a con man. He was a criminal, but he would occasionally show up at the Rockefeller home with a big wad of bills, with a big wad of cash, and kind of give a little bit of money to his wife at the time. By the way, he had multiple families, so he was like just bouncing around in different towns in Ohio and throughout the U.S. and had a couple different families. And so John D. Rockefeller was kind of like the man of the house. He was the oldest, and he basically like looked after his little brothers. He kind of looked after his mom. He got a job pretty young, and he worked at this essentially like commodity trader. So commodity. I don't know if you know what commodities trading is, but it's basically like, I want to give like a very simple explanation, but you can like kind of like securitize like products and commodities like corn and wheat. You can buy those things and you can trade them at different prices. But he basically worked for like the manual version of that back in the day, which was literally like they had a truckload of corn come in, they would store it in a warehouse, and then they would sell it to somebody else who could actually distribute that corn or package it or process it. So he kind of worked at this like commodity trading company. It was a very, very small thing. This was a very common type of business, not back in the day. Farmers needed to drop off their corn somewhere. They didn't have the expertise to actually process it. So you sell your corn to one of these like commodity businesses, and then they would sell it to a manufacturer or a processor for that corn or that wheat or whatever commodity it is that they were trading. So John D. Rockefeller kind of worked at that company for a while. I think he was like high school age at this point. And kind of like learned the ropes of accounting. So his claim to fame was that he was like a notorious record keeper and tracker. So he was very, very like meticulous in tracking his records and his expenses. And at the time, something called double entry accounting was kind of a prerequisite for any sort of, excelling in anything related to finance at that time. You needed to be good at double entry bookkeeping. And so John D. Rockefeller was kind of known for being very like calm and quiet. So he was not a very loud guy, and he was super calm. He was like someone that you couldn't rattle him. And so at the time he's at this business, like John kind of gets and by the way, I think there was only 3 of them. They're like the 2 partners, and then John was like the apprentice at this little business. And he kind of gains this reputation for just being like very reliable and just a really good worker. And so eventually he decides like, I don't want to do this business anymore. I'm going to go out and start my company. And this is I think he's in his mid-20s at this point. And he starts Standard Oil. So he basically does this commodities type of business, but for oil, right? Crude oil. So he would buy crude oil from drillers, and then he would, sell it to people that could process it and refine it. And so that's kind of how Standard Oil starts. But the interesting thing was that he ends up realizing that there's lots of money in the refining business, right? So like oil refiners basically took crude oil, you refine it, and then you could basically turn it into kerosene, which was used in all the lighting of that time. So like everything that all like lamps and lanterns and lights was, fueled by kerosene. And so he basically starts this, he starts acquiring oil refineries in his mid-20s, right? So he's basically going out and he's buying oil refineries from various people in Ohio. And oil refineries were kind of like people that drilled for oil. It was like almost like a cowboy's business. Like it was very risky, really hard to do, very dangerous. Like have you seen There Will Be Blood? You've seen that movie, yep. Right? That's like the drilling side of it. It's like cowboys business. People are like, those are wild people. The same thing is kind of true for refineries. Like refineries are not always like these beautiful, clean, like polished, like processing plants that require tons of capital. Like to refine oil, it wasn't that intensive of a process. There were a few steps, and you had to like heat it and filter it and do a couple things. And what was really interesting is that in his mid-20s, he goes out and he's just starting buying these like refiners from like mom and pops. Refineries caught on fire all the time, extremely dangerous. Oil prices would surge and they would drop, and refineries would go out of business, drillers would go out of business. And so this oil market was basically like an old style EKG monitor, where it's just like, this up and down and up and down and up and down. And oil prices were, the cause of that. Like they were always going up, always going down, and it's because this steady supply of oil just didn't exist. We didn't have hundreds and thousands of companies drilling for oil that could kind of produce like a steady supply of oil. And Rockefeller kind of saw this and he said to himself, this industry needs to be organized. It needs to be stable. And so he starts buying up all these refineries. And so if you can imagine where this is going, like the price of crude oil and refined oil is kind of dependent on what the refineries are willing to buy it for and what they're willing to sell it for. And so if you can have a monopoly on the refineries, you can kind of control the price of oil and make it very stable. And if you can have a monopoly, you can set the price for anything and you can make tons of money. And so he basically set out to go buy these refineries. And there's some stories of him, by the way, so like towards the end of his 20s, early mid 30s, he's buying up refineries in oil in Ohio. And he had this crazy nickname, which I think he had, like, there was like the Ohio like cannibal or something like that. It was something really hard. And he was basically like, people like feared him, but also kind of liked it. But he would basically show up at a refinery and he would sit down with the owner and he would say, look, and his tone would never change. He'd be like, look, your refinery is in trouble. It's going to go out of business. And I just wanted to warn you that if you don't sell to me, you're going to lose everything. But there's a way out, right? I'm going to give you this much money and you're going to give me your refinery. And they would always freak out and be really mad. And he would just never change his tone. He'd be extremely level. And he would just like tell them in very like plain English, like, this is what's going to happen. I need to buy your refinery because blah, blah, blah. And then, they would always say like, screw off, go away. Right. And then 2 days later, they would just sell him the refinery because all of the other refiners around were just going out of business or they were selling to Rockefeller. And so he was just accumulating refineries in this kind of like cold and calm, like just one after the other, just buying up refineries and, standardizing them and making them work, more operationally efficient and have better bookkeeping and just adding order. He just like created order in the oil industry. And he was known for like later, sort of in board meetings and by his employees, everybody kind of had the same take on Rockefeller, which was that he was extremely calm, extremely level, and he didn't say much at all. He only said like the bare minimum of what was necessary. And he would do this thing in like board meetings. And one of the things, so there's this quote, which is like, John D. Rockefeller is the best executive the United States has ever produced, something like that. It was basically, he's the best at being an executive that we've ever seen. And one of the reasons for that is because he was kind of a master delegator. He could just like assemble the people and then he was just able to like let them facilitate things for him. And he would have these meetings. So he'd have these big meetings where 15 or 20 of his executives from the different states, or not even different states, like whenever he would have these meetings, he'd have 20 people come in and he would just sit there silently. And he would basically close his eyes and interlace his fingers behind his head and lean back. And he would just let the meeting go on. And he would just sit there and he wouldn't say anything. And they would all be talking and like, oh, what should we do about this? And what should we do about this? And he wouldn't say absolutely anything. And then a question would come his way and he would like gently open his eyes and he would just like give a very calm answer, or he would ask a question. He just like wouldn't, like, he would just be like extremely sort of like terse and short-winded. And that was kind of what he was known for. He was just a master at assembling people and letting them figure things out and incentivizing them properly. And, it's something that like definitely not natural for me to be that way. But I think there's a lot to learn from that kind of style of just kind of, empowering other, people on your team to like, figure things out for you and incentivizing them properly and allowing kind of awesome people to do the job. But anyway, that's kind of the long story of it. But he was a super interesting guy.
Yeah, just some more context about him and the way he thought and stuff. And yeah.